Thank you very much indeed. And as you can see, we've got a nice full panel. And if you've done the math, you'll see that we've got an additional person in our lineup. And that is Ashley Mullinger. And Ashley is an independent fisherman based in Norfolk. And I'm going to ask you, Ashley, if you'd like to take a minute to introduce yourself and a minute perhaps also on the theme of the session, if you would like, before we start to take questions.
Of course.
Would you like to have the podium for that?
Yes. Oh, no, I can do sat down. That's
okay,
fine.
it's entirely up to you.
Sorry, I'm having a hair malfunction as well. Hi, everyone. I'm an independent fisherman, and it's a really great opportunity to be able to speak in this space. I'm not a public speaker, so, bear with me. But my day-to-day life is spent within the heart of the UK's largest offshore... I'm going to have to give up on my hair. UK's largest offshore wind zone, where fishing, renewable energy and marine habitat restoration are all colliding to make a very, very complicated space for management. Now, within the fisheries sector, many people know me as the female fisherman. It's a social media handle that I use to broadcast day-to-day life at sea, and I broadcast to around 13,500 people. But beyond this, I'm a trustee of a charity called Fishing into the Future, which is an organisation set up to give fishermen the tools to exist in a landscape where co-management and coexistence is happening. I also do the digital comms for a small non-profit organisation called UK Women in Fisheries, which aims to connect and empower women across the sector. Last year, I also published my first book, which is called My Fishing Life, and it aimed to open up the sector, its complexities, the joys of fishing, the sometimes really, really hard stuff about it too, to a wider audience in a way that made sense in sort of layman's terms, as it is. Now, when it comes to balancing the expansion of renewable energy with the future of our fragile fishing fleet, and it is fragile, I think that point's probably been made quite clear, I fear the ambition for net zero carries an uncomfortable truth hidden in plain sight. Zero net, zero boats, and zero future prospects for one of our most sustainable and climate-friendly assets, which is fish. Now, I'm not ignorant to the health of our planet or the rising need for cleaner and greener energy. However, in order to build truly multifunctional and healthy seas, we must look to the de facto guardians of these spaces, the 11,000 fishermen we have left, whose intimate relationship with the seas could be the solution to not compromising our food security when trying to secure our energy security. Thank you. Sorry, that's quite a long intro.
Thank you very much, Ashley. So now we open up the session for questions, and we've got until 2 p.m, so we've got just over 45 minutes, and we've already got some questions, but I'm going to pay attention as well to the top deck, because having sat up there for several occasions and seen that questions were missed, I won't overlook you on the ground floor, but if I'm scanning the top disproportionately, there's a reason for that. Also, I can't really see because of the bright lights. But I just ask, is there anything on the top deck? If you're raising your hand, can you wave it? Because I cannot see it. Yes, let's go with that. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. Aoife Martin from Seafish. I have a question for Mike, Rob and Ashley primarily. How do we communicate the good work that is happening by the fishing industry and the seafood supply chain to address some of the complex problems that influence the public's view on fishing? I'm thinking about things like crew welfare mechanisms, code of welfare for crustaceans, science and data and research, innovative fishing gear trials and projects. The list is endless, but I think to the wider public, I think that that work is kind of almost missing in the dialogue.
Thank you, Aoife. So your question was addressed to two people in particular, right?
Yeah, to probably Rob, Ashley and Mike. Just how do we get the wider narrative of the good work that the fishing industry is actually doing to address some of the problems out there? Because I just don't think it's as well understood as it possibly could be.
Okay, so any of the named individuals like to answer?
Okay, I'll kick off. Thanks, Aoife. It's an incredibly good question. It's an incredibly difficult one to answer. We are not particularly good at communicating those things, I don't think, to the wider public. I think that the day job often gets in the way of trying to talk more about what we do. I think CFish, which Aoife represents, has a really important role to play in this. I think we probably need to get rather better at working alongside you and your expertise in communications. I make no bones about it. I'm not a communications professional. We're not a particularly large organisation. We don't have one. There is a whole skill set out there that we need to kind of tap into where we can. But it's a really difficult challenge, and this is a really unsatisfactory answer. But we're engaged in so much work around these things that actually telling other people about it is very, very challenging. And I guess we look to others to help us in a lot of respects, to talk about what they're doing alongside us, to acknowledge what industry does, when it works alongside research projects, works alongside kind of ENGO-driven projects. And agencies like CFish and government agencies too can help us out. But yeah, we need to be better at it. But it's hard to find the time and it's hard to find the resource to put into that, I think.
Rob, you caught my eye. Did you want to?
Thank you. Pick up a newspaper and it's full of bad news, right? No one is particularly engaged in the good news stories. There are many, and as Mike has said, we need to be able to tell our good news stories better. I would like to make a cogent argument that coastal fisheries around England are some of the best managed in the world, but I suspect there's very few people who would have the information and tools to support that argument. So we need to make our case, and we need to make it understood that fisheries management works, and it does support our coastal communities.
How do you address Mike's point that there simply isn't time? In other words, you're already dealing with many other issues. How do you find the time to promote?
Well, it's resourcing.
Yes.
Yeah, it's hideously under-resourced, frankly. Yeah. I mean, I reflected on coming to this conference about the successes of other countries' restoration initiatives, then look at the money that's spent in the US on restoration. It's many orders of magnitude greater than we're investing. That is why there's more profile.
Just before I come back to Mike, I just wanted to ask, I mean, Ashley, you're writing books, you're blogging. What's your answer to Aoife's question?
I think that we've forgotten that the fish in the sea are a public resource, and they belong to everybody in this country. And for a large part, people really care about the fishing industry. We saw it in your presentation, you know, from the workshops that were done in Poole and Whitby, and the studies that were carried out with the public. People want to know what's happening out there, but you know what? It's so complicated, and we use language that's sometimes way up here, and it's a case of breaking it down and making it simple. I try and do it on my social media so that the public can understand what's happening in this space and how one thing affects another thing and how complex it is. But let's just break through all that and make things really, really simple again and communicate simply.
Mike, you had a follow-up.
Yeah, just something I should have said, and Ashley's just said it better than I was going to anyway. It's making it simple. The problem we've got in communicating is the things we're trying to communicate are really complex. It's quite a nuanced story to say, for example, Batley spoke really well about the difficulties of balancing different kinds of fishing, and some kinds of fishing are damaging to some kinds of seabed, but they're not damaging to all kinds of seabed, and they're not damaging in all places. And some of those fisheries have occurred in those places for 40, 50, 60 years and are still catching as much. They're not doing damage there, but in the wrong place. It's a really hard thing to get across. My organisation gets contacted by the media quite a lot. And when you get a call from the Today programme on some complicated issue, and they'll say, could you explain it in 15 seconds? We might not use all of your quote. That's really, really hard. That's really, really hard. Trying to persuade people that what you're doing, honestly, it's quite good and it works, but it isn't simple. It's hard when people expect simplicity when everything can be boiled down to a TikTok video. actually some of the good work that we're doing, some of the projects that everybody's talking about here today, they don't really lend themselves to that. And frankly, if they did, they would probably be missing something.
Unless any of you had an urge to add to the array of answers, we'll move on to the next question. So I saw, yes, there's a question just there, please. Thank you. Yep.
Hi, Chrissy Ingle, 7 Estuary Partnership. On the subject of diversification or just transition, I know if I was told I wouldn't be able to do my job or use the equipment I'd bought anymore in the manner that I'd grown up or used throughout my career, I would struggle. So how are fishermen dealing with that kind of just transition? How is it being received? And another question for Joe was evidence collection by fishermen considered as a diversification activity?
Thank you. Claire, I wondered if, on the basis of the interviews that you've carried out, you'd like to have the first bash at answering that. Thank you.
So that was one of the things I talked to the fishermen about potential to switch gears. So obviously I didn't cover all the results, but we asked how they have responded to displacement or to having to kind of readjust to these offshore wind farms. So switching gears was one option, changing vessels, but purchasing a new vessel, but that was another one, and various others. And the response was that with some gear types, it's possible to switch. So some boats do operate different gear types in different seasons. But other boats, it's just very difficult to switch from one gear type to another. So, for example, a potting boat probably wouldn't be suitable for trawling or anything else. So, in that sense, financially, it's not really viable, and it's a different skill set. So I'm interested, perhaps in Joe, some more detail out of the results that you found in your study as to, did you find any feasibility in kind of altering between different gear types? And another option that's talked about is fishing boats being able to work as guard vessels in wind farms or having opportunities to operate within the wind farms on their kind of duties. But again, apparently only a very small number of vessels would be eligible or appropriate for that type of work. So it's kind of talked about as an option, but in reality, it's not feasible for a lot of fishermen. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to sort of come in on that as well. And that's something that I think, as part of, we were focusing initially of trying to answer that question, what is a just transition? Everyone's talking about it in fisheries, but actually, how do we even assess that? And which is, so the focus was trying to design this framework that can ask some of those questions to see, within the scope and the baseline, is that, what are those just transition options? Are they even feasible? And as you say, there might be some fishermen that actually, they don't want to go to another target fishery, or they simply will refuse to go into another industry, which is, I completely get that. So I think part of that is really important to have those discussions, build up that evidence to understand, okay, what is feasible, what do people want, what can they go into, what is even possible in terms of the carrying capacities, the areas, the sizes of those scenarios, and then have those discussions around how can that be supported to transition into those options. So and to answer the question around we engaged with some sectors of fishermen, but it's something that we haven't done, and I think the next step of that is absolutely is early engagement. We've heard it a lot over the last couple of days, but meaningful and genuine engagement with all those affected to really understand how that can be applied and those practical costs and routes to transition.
Thanks, Joe. And Ashley?
I just wanted to come in on that very briefly about this diversification and changing fishing methods. Because the realities of it, as I see it, I'm a small boat, and my boat is set up to do the things that I need to do. If I wanted to change those methods, there's a lot of regulation in place that's going to stop me doing that. And that comes from a safety point of view, that comes from licensing point of views, and also it comes from what stock is actually available to catch. And then let's not forget that, let's say you're successful in changing over, you've got the license to do it, you've gone through the safety stuff, then you get your catch back to the land. Is the infrastructure there anymore? No, it's not, because our industry is in decline. It is fragile. I don't have the transport, logistics networks. I don't have fish markets or access to multiple different options. So diversification, I think, is something that we all really, really want in the small scale, and an ability to be able to react to a changing environment, but actually being able to do it practically is very, very difficult, and there's a lot of barriers in the way.
Thank you very much for emphasising the
Thank
practical
you.
difficulties. There's a question from Sligo. Maybe from Sligo, but... Oh, it's not. It's actually from Dickon in person.
No, it's from
Okay.
It's from Slido. We've got one question on Slido that's been upvoted nearly 75 times, so I think I have to ask this, and it's about supply chain, I guess. And there's a question about how you can link fishing to food security when we export so much of our fish. And there's a stat here that says when we export 90% of our fish, and I don't know if that's true or not.
No, it isn't.
But I think there is a general question about supply chain and food security and how we tie that into kind of national priorities.
So, Mike, you want to kick off?
Firstly, we don't export anything like 90% of our fish. That's not true. Again, quite hard when it's very easy to say untrue things. It takes us a really long time to communicate the truth. We don't export 90% of our what we catch. I would love it if we didn't export as much as we do. That would be great if we ate more of it, if there was more of a market. Of course we don't want that. I would love us to be saving on the transport costs, as well as all the carbon that enters the food chain locally. We're the ultimate in free-range food. I'd love it if we could reduce the food miles even further. And secondly, we talk about food security and national security, and the fact that we export food for people to eat elsewhere, I don't see as a very bad thing. I don't think anybody's security suffers by everybody having enough to eat. And we shouldn't diminish the fact that other people eating our catch is also important to their security, food security, personal security, and our national security. We have a stabler world if nobody is hungry. So I don't buy that as a criticism, really. I don't think it's valid. And it's not like we're choosing to sell it overseas because we somehow don't want it to be eaten here. We just don't have a tradition of eating some species that there is elsewhere. And we are fundamentally an industry. If people want to buy the thing like any other product, we don't complain about the British car industry exporting cars. We see it as a good thing. We are part of a global economy, and it's kind of fruitless to pretend we can be insular and things are only good if we make them and consume them within our little island nation and we're not part of the planet. That doesn't hold. National security includes economic security. It includes stable jobs and stable communities. It's much more complicated than just a Frenchman ate my lobster.
Alistair. On the subject of home market versus export, would you like to comment?
I certainly think there are issues here, as much as I definitely agree with everything Mike said there. I think culturally we don't value our fishing industry and our seafood to the same extent they do in some other countries. I mean, much of the product that the guys I work with catch is exported, and we often ask ourselves, well, why? And the answer is that often they're willing to pay a lot more for it in other countries than we are here. So there is definitely a cultural question about how we value our seafood and how we eat. And we're a nation of fast food eaters, and culturally we just don't value our food in the same way. So I think that's a wider societal problem. Obviously, that reflects on the fishing industry to some extent. But I definitely think we could invest a lot more in valuing the food that we produce domestically. There's maybe a carbon footprint issue as well. But again, I think a lot of that isn't something the fishing industry in of itself can fix or take complete responsibility for. This is something that wider public discourse has to have a conversation about. Is it how do we improve our diets? How do we value high quality seafood and sustainable seafood? And then how much of our income are we willing to dispose on that?
Right, well, thank you both. I've got a question from 3 rows back here at the front. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. Mike Elliott from IX and the University of Hull. And I should also say I'm chair of the North Eastern IFCA, but that's got nothing to do with this question. We've had wind farms, offshore wind farms, slightly longer than this conference has been going. I guess the earliest ones were in the early 1990s. In Denmark, having them slightly longer. And I'm just wondering from Claire, whether you gave a long litany of problems. I think some of those problems are let's call them qualitative. We think they could happen, but they might not be quantitative. And I'm just wondering, in those 35 years, what have we learned to overcome the problems that you're outlining? Because 35 years is quite a long time. And if we still have all those antagonisms between fishing and offshore wind farms, we're obviously not doing something right, or doing quite a lot of things wrong. But
Yeah, I think it was 2000 the first operational commercial turbines were installed in the UK. So I guess we've had it for 20, 25 years. When you say the list of problems, do you mean the ones from the impacts that the fishermen have outlined, or?
You give a list of concerns that the fishermen have about offshore wind farms. Now, as you know, I mean, we've done a lot of work on perceptions of problems in the marine environment, but then when you try and find evidence for those, the public perceive them, but very often it's trying to find evidence. But of course, if the public think there's a problem, by definition there is a problem. We have to deal with it.
Yeah, there was quite a detailed report done by CFAS. I think it was like 2005, 2006. So in the very early stages, when we just had very few wind farms and obviously a lot smaller, smaller turbines, less turbines. And really, if you look at the kind of issues highlighted in that report, they went out and spoke to fishermen and did quite extensive survey work. It's kind of exactly the same things that the fishermen are saying today. So I don't know if we have really addressed any of those issues or if they're just kind of growing with offshore wind. It certainly seemed that the same issues were being highlighted, but the major one, which other people have talked about, is displacement, or Mike mentioned, you can't just keep displacing fishing. So it's not just wind farms, it's obviously MPAs, conservation objectives, other industries. So over the past 20, 25 years, all of these other things have grown, and then wind farms then exacerbate that issue. So I think displacement is that major issue, and I'm not sure how we can address that because we need to build these wind farms. So it's probably a case of looking at prioritizing really important fishing areas and trying not to build on those areas. So all this talk about spatial management and spatial prioritization, I think, is probably a key answer, but there is no one solution, I don't think.
Ashley had a point she wanted to add to that.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, I mentioned in my introduction that I work in an area that is highly populated with wind turbines, and displacement is a real thing. And there are so many. I don't want to come across like I'm bashing these sites, because I do understand the need for clean energy, but the problems they create within fishing communities runs really, really deep, and nobody's talking about it. You mentioned within your presentation about compensation structures, and I'm going to address the elephant in the room. Lots of fishermen made a lot of money out of these sites, and with that money, more and more pots are being put on the ground. This is compromising food security versus energy security. And until we start looking at these compensation structures and actually asking these big operators of wind farm sites to start giving back to fishing communities, not necessarily financially, I'm talking supporting our infrastructure. I'm talking about supporting new entrants into our industry. Otherwise, we're going to completely lose our industry. I'm sorry for talking so passionately about it. It's something I feel really, really strongly about.
I think
so. Yeah, thank you.
I think we're all delighted that you're talking passionately about it. And thank you very much for putting a practical spin on one of the very clear results from Claire's research. There's a question in the balcony which I'm being pointed to. So, where is the question?
To your left.
So I don't have a question, I'm just shielding my eyes. Someone in the balcony had a question.
On the side to your
left.
left.
Thank you.
Hi, Kat Bruce from Nature Metrics. From a consumer perspective, and I guess this is sort of the other end of the question that was asked earlier from Slido, but how can we as consumers spend our money on buying fish that we can really have confidence is supporting low-impact, small-scale fisheries without inadvertently contributing to harmful practices and smashing up the seafloor in marine protected areas. Are there any labels, any supply chains that we can really trust for that, or is it really about going and only buying fish sort of from the source?
Alistair, did you want to go first?
I can go that, yeah. I think the first thing we've got to realise is that there's no way to almost do anything at all without unintended consequences. Even driving to the shop has an impact on what you're doing. So this idea that somehow we can completely, not have to accept any responsibility for the things we're buying or defer that everything we're buying is somehow benign. I think we got to first recognise that that's not really possible at all in anything that we do. But there's a spectrum, and I think there are a lot of small-scale local fisheries is where I would point you to. Try and meet your local fishers, try and understand what the issues are locally, and ask yourself where you want to put your money. There are a lot of great initiatives. There are local box schemes. There are small-scale fishing organisations that can point you in the right direction. But I mean, if you live anywhere near the coast, literally go and meet your fishers. Ask them about the issues and think about where you want to put your money. And if you live further away from the coast, then I mean there are various ethical schemes that do badging and labelling. I mean they've all got their issues as well. But I mean this is not a bad place to start. If you want to invest in sustainable fisheries, then look for sustainable fisheries marketed products. I think that would be where I would start anyway.
Okay, Ashley next, and then Joe. Yep.
I get asked this question quite a lot. I do direct sales to customers on the quay. The nice thing is they can see my social media, so they know the scale of my business and they know how I operate. But I generally, as a rule of thumb, tell people to ask 3 questions of your fish, which is who caught it, when was it caught, and where was it caught. And if you can answer those 3 questions and you're satisfied with the answer that comes back, then go ahead and buy that fish, because traceability and transparency in our industry, I think, is paramount to its future.
Yeah, just to follow on from that, I obviously can't speak from an industry perspective, but I think something that will help with exactly traceability, and Rob, you touched on it as well, in terms of where it comes from, is having effective, appropriate vessel tracking monitoring systems on all vessels, so we can understand where they're fishing. That can also feed into traceability factors, but also into stock assessments, catch per unit effort, and also into any understand when it comes to sort of displacement from other marine energies, that what fair or equitable compensation could be or should be had. So I think that's something that could be done, or a tool to be used to help.
Mike,
Just a very quick point. I guess ultimately our aim then, if we do what I was suggesting earlier, we have a strategy to manage our fisheries properly. We have a management plan and a sustainable harvesting strategy for any fishery. Our objective has got to be that you can buy any piece of UK caught fish and be confident that it has been caught from a sustainable fishery. That's the end goal. I'm not about to claim we are there now, but I do think we're on a journey towards it. Traceability, vessel monitoring, hugely important in doing that, but that's got to be our goal, so that you don't need to inquire too hard about exactly who caught it and where. If you've got it properly badged, you should be able to trust that it's done right. That's a big ask, but there's no harm in being ambitious there. And also, just throw it in there, go to local independent fishmongers, buy direct from boats. Those sorts of things give you a lot of reassurance in the short term.
Thank you. We're going to go to the wider world now. Dickon's got a question from Slido.
I'm going to combine a couple of questions, if that's okay. The first question is about co-location and coexistence. So if co-location and coexistence for everyone is a fallacy, what do you see as the compromises? The question is asked for the fishing industry, but I would say that everybody needs to make in that space. And also, could you give us some examples of the fishing industry moving towards more sustainable practices? I think there's been lots of that in the talks today as well, but that was quite a highly voted question too.
Okay, so the first part of the question, potentially any of you might like to answer that, but Claire, thank you.
So there's certainly potential for, so I think trawl gears or any gear, the mobile fishing gears, will struggle to operate inside a wind farm, unless the turbines are massively widely spaced apart. But even then, you've got cables to trawl over and lots of different safety considerations. So I think essentially it will be very difficult for mobile gear to co-locate or coexist. But in terms of static gear, there has been recent work looking at the success of potting, for example, around close to turbine bases and inside wind farms. So again, there are logistical, safety, financial issues related to that. But because at the moment, if anything gets damaged in terms of the wind farm, then the fisherman is liable. So that's obviously a big responsibility. But in terms of the success of actually being able to operate, there are more opportunities for static gear that are currently being investigated. So yeah, there are potential opportunities, but a lot of probably logistical issues to iron out as well.
Rob, did you want to?
I would like to address the second question, if I may. Examples of where fisheries have moved to be well managed. In English waters, out to 6 nautical miles, all fishing activities are compatible with the conservation objectives of the marine protected areas which are designated. So some 40+% of our coastal waters are designated as an MPA in one form or another. And the fishing activity which is conducted within those is consistent with the conservation objectives of those. And that is world leading. It's far greater protection than the rest of Europe has achieved, and it should provide reassurance. It's difficult, it's hard, and tough decisions have been made. But if you look in other areas, such as the Netherlands, where those decisions weren't made, they've lost vast parts of their shellfish fisheries. We have managed through the difficult process to reconcile the conservation objectives with a continuation of certain fisheries. So I think we can be proud of that achievement. It's been very difficult and poorly understood, but it's my job, I think, is to help people be more aware of that progress which has been made, because it reflects well on our fishing industry.
Thank you both. Can I just ask a question with regard to that first question we had, which is, so my understanding is when we get to floating offshore, we can have tension leg platforms where the chain goes straight down to the seabed and there's no splay. And then we have platforms where the chain doesn't go straight down and instead it splays out wide. And so it sounds to me as if tension leg platform would help, but on the other hand, the message I sort of hear through the ether is that it's not very popular. Do any of you know anything about that?
A little bit. I think that speaking to colleagues who work in the offshore wind industry, there's still a lot of uncertainty about what kind of mooring systems are going to be most appropriate in floating offshore wind, which is going to be the really big development in offshore wind coming. Most engineers that I've spoken to are talking about those catenary moorings, these kind of big splays where you're looking at about 900 meters each side of the turbine. So this is where kind of what I was talking about when I said it's a fallacy to think that everything can happen everywhere. In a floating wind farm with 100 turbines, each sitting in the middle of an 1,800 meter diameter circle where there are concealed anchor chains, big chains in the water, 4 or 5 per turbine, you cannot safely operate fishing gear in there. You can't. There's a huge amount of invisible obstacles hidden under the water. It's not safe. You will not co-locate fishing with that kind of wind farm. You just won't. You can design a floating wind farm to make it less inimical to fishing in the local area. Maybe it involves bunching those turbines together a little bit more, which might reduce output by 2 or 3%, perhaps. That's 2 or 3% off the bottom line for the operator, but considering their profits are measured in the billions, they might be able to cope with that. And we could then make it a little bit easier for those two industries both to exist in the same region, but they're not existing in the same space. We have to balance, we have to take those difficult decisions sometimes that what we need more is energy in that space. What we need more is food supply in that space. And we'll have to balance and we'll have to accommodate with one another. And actually, I think what industries have been quite good at doing is working that out between themselves. The wind industry and the fishing industry have been talking for quite a while about how we're going to manage to rub along because there hasn't been a kind of governmental level decision on some of these things. I think we're actually seeing government realising more now that there's going to have to be some decisions taken. And I'm quite comfortable with that in some ways. I would rather we had decisions taken that we got a chance to have our say, to make our case, and so does everybody else with wanting to claim parts of the sea. And somebody takes a decision and owns that decision and lives with it. And then we have to live with it too. As long as we've had a say and had the opportunity to make our point, we can't, no sector can expect to win every argument. But as long as we're given a fair chance to make our case in the national interest and in the interest of our communities, we can't realistically ask for much more. But nobody is very well served by continually pretending that everyone can have everything everywhere all at the same time. It's just postponing the difficult decision and, waiting until after the next election for somebody else to take the blame. We've got to stop that at some point.
Thank you very much. I'm going to come back to the room, and there was a question over here, and then we'll go to the world again.
Thank you very much. I'm Angus Wilson from Natural Power. I'm in Fisheries Liaison, and I used to work as a buyer up in Peterhead in the net broth industry. So I was responsible for the large majority of prawns, or langoustines rather, landed in Scotland. Alistair, I'd like to thank you for being an actual representative of Scotland up on the stage today. I've heard very little about us from everyone else. But there's still been absolutely no mention throughout this entire panel of the work that's been happening up in Peterhead and Fraserburgh. These are massive ports that are responsible for, hang on, I've got a number here, over 200,000 tonnes of whitefish being exported each year to a tune of £250 million. These are also communities that are struggling incredibly badly. Peterhead recently, in 2022, recorded in almost every metric an overwhelmingly poor quality of city centre life. These isolated communities up in the northeast are suffering far, far more than other harbours that I've been to around the country. The harbours like Arbroath, Montrose, Pittenweem, all the way up to Berghead, Buckie, as far away as Mallaig. These are all communities that really, really struggle and have just all the money that does come into these industries is very much being spent on the upkeep of the vessels and just maintaining what they can do. A lot of the talk in this conference has been about preserving the seabed, but at what point do we need to prioritise the communities? How many vessels need to be decommissioned? How many generational livelihoods need to be broken? And how many communities that are tourist attractions on the Northeast 250, the North Coast 500, how many of these small communities need to be destroyed so that we can have a better seabed? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Alistair.
I don't know if I can answer the last part of that question, but I think I can talk a little bit about one of the issues that we have, certainly in Scotland especially. In Scotland we have a thing called the National Marine Plan. Unfortunately, it doesn't really involve fisheries. It was scoped into the first iteration of the National Marine Plan. We're now consulting on the second iteration, and we're trying to scope fisheries out, and I think that's a potentially disastrous issue because it's in things like National Marine Planning where we should be looking at exactly those kind of issues and asking exactly these sort of questions. And there's another element I think has been discussed here quite a lot this weekend, and that's good environmental status. It's a commitment we made a long time ago, but yet we don't have a programme of measures which are actually capable of delivering it. The original commitment was good environmental status by 2020. I'd like to point out that it's 2025, and we still don't actually have a programme of measures that are capable of delivering. So the National Marine Plan and the programme of measures, the people who are responsible for delivering that, and unfortunately it's not the fishing industry, but whoever are responsible for delivering that have to sit in a room and figure out the answer to the questions that you've just asked. Exactly what do we have to do? How much fishing opportunity is going to be lost? Exactly who we should divvy up the resource base to? What kind of investments we need in society to realise the vision that put on the table? It's one thing saying we've got a commitment for a biodiversity strategy or a good environmental status and so on and so forth, but without some kind of a structure on what that actually means, then it's a recipe for failure. And at the moment, I think what you're describing in these fishing communities in the east coast of Scotland is the realisation of that recipe for failure.
Thank you. Joe.
Just very quickly to add to that, and probably tell from my accent, I'm based in Scotland as well, and I've done quite a lot of work on the southeast coast, so in Eyemouth, St Abbs, Calderdale, with fishermen there, and I've witnessed it firsthand in terms of the communities there, but also the fishing fleet, who have sadly declined as well. And I think, yeah, your questions are absolutely valid. But with that, I do think that we do know you can have both. Like we can have, areas that are protected for ecosystems to not only halt the decline, but actually start recovering alongside thriving, sustainable fisheries, and where we can protect these, generational fishermen for the long term. I mean, we need to see that. At the moment, we're seeing fishermen, as Rob highlighted from the research, they're declining at a really alarming rate. And actually, we want to make sure we have these areas that are well protected, ecosystems recovering, but also benefiting fisheries and increasing fisheries, which by that helps the local communities and harbours and towns as well. So,
thank you both for a response to that. I'm going to go to the balcony now. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. My name is Badis Chiari. I'm also with Seafish. I was a field researcher last summer, so I got the privilege to speak with 104 fishermen all across the Shetlands down to Kent, Essex, Wales. And one issue that they mentioned, a lot of them, was seals. And I think that's something that's going to increase in the future. And so in the aspect of restoration efforts and fishing, a lot of the fishermen complain that there's an abundance of seals now stealing their fish. There's no natural predators. So a lot of them ask me, can I shoot them? And I winced as an ecologist. But I don't know, what are the solutions? And I'd be, I'm keen to hear what the panel has to say on how to solve this issue of seals.
Well, there's a controversial subject. And is anyone just wants to be the first? Oh, Rob, you actually want to be the first.
So I would like to launch the orca restoration program today. In that, there's a serious point. You're absolutely right. The fishermen that we're speaking to, there is a real challenge there. One of the issues I think that we've spoken about is the effective licensing of the release of rehabilitated seals. So we have seen wonderfully an expansion of seal range, but I don't think we've considered the consequences of their interactions with a commercial fishing fleet. I think overall everyone wants a balanced ecosystem, and part of that is making sure that the introduction is effectively achieved.
Yeah. Sticking my neck out.
It is. I am sticking my neck out on that because it is a difficult subject.
I'll stick my neck out a little bit as well. And actually, the guy that asked that question, hi, I think you came down and saw me for the survey. Where I fish, we have a massive seal colony. I think it's one of the biggest in Europe, actually. And actually, what I've noticed is with our whelk pots, the seals have now learned how to get in and get the bait, which says to me, hey, guess what? There's not enough fish for them. So if they're having to rely on human interaction to feed themselves, then and I don't know what the answer is, but there needs to be something. There needs to be a measure to make sure that that population can actually sustain itself organically, not having to rely on human input. Thank you.
Dickon.
I'm going to try and combine
three.
Yeah.
Okay.
So someone has noted that as an outsider on fisheries, they're amazed there's no fishing industry strategy, and asking who should be leading it. And someone else has said, would it help if we had a cross-departmental marine minister to address siloisation of decisions and sectors? And then there's a third part within that strategy. Do we think that small-scale local fisheries should be encouraged over industrial fisheries? So should we be encouraging the restriction of industrial fisheries more in that strategy?
So, Mike, I was looking up when I missed the first part, but the second part was about the Ministry for the Marine.
The first part was, should there be a fishing strategy, effectively?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so clearly I think there should be a fishing strategy because that's what my talk was about. We've evolved fast to say I've changed my mind at this point. I think a lot of cross-departmental work is definitely necessary to do this. I don't know if I think we need another minister for it specifically, or whether we just need different departments to communicate well. I can see a few people from government department in the room, so they might have kind of more views on it than me. I think in terms of restricting industrial fisheries, I'm never quite sure what we mean by an industrial fishery. Do we just mean a boat that employs quite a few people? You need the right kind of boat to catch different kinds of fish in different kinds of places. There is no point in expecting a small inshore boat to travel 60 miles north of Shetland or off into Norwegian waters and look for pelagic species that are really important to supplying people in various parts of the world. We need balance. The fishing strategy needs to do just that. It needs to balance our needs for food supply, our needs for employment, our opportunities for growth, our places where perhaps our fisheries are not well balanced with the local environment. It doesn't need to be about picking out one sector and saying, you're the baddies because I don't like the sound of it, because I don't really understand it very well, but it doesn't sound very nice. So we shouldn't have any of that. We need to be taking a more dispassionate, evidence-based look at what we need. That's what I mean by talking about an industrial strategy for fishery. What do we need in order for that industry to work well for the nation and to thrive, and not just provide food, but provide jobs, and respect the kind of cultural values that fishing represents in communities that are not well represented in settings like this, because they're just not very easy to approach. It's kind of hard to approach, as I'm sure you'll have found out, the chap there who's done research, it's kind of hard to get hold of people and ask them their opinion when they go to work at 3 o'clock in the morning. It's not really easy to get hold of and engage with those communities. So we need a strategy to be balanced and to be really strongly evidence-based on need. And it does need to be cross-departmental. At the minute, there's been a lot of interest within government about a fishing strategy, something that the NFFO has been pushing for a little while now, and we've got a lot of interest from government departments. We had a letter from the Secretary of State accepting some of our points, actually writing on behalf of the Prime Minister, because we put an open letter out, and we got a good response to it. DEFRA is pretty well engaged with this, has talked to us quite a bit. It's the other departments that we need to bring on board. I was talking about before, Department for Transport, Home Office, Education. All of these things are part of treating us as an industry, not just pigeonholing one of the things that we are involved with and saying that's all of it. DEFRA on its own is never going to make the fishing industry thriving and sustainable in the future. We need a lot more to it.
Mike, and we've only got 2 minutes left, so I'm going to see if Alistair, you might like to say something, but also Claire, I wondered if, based on the perspective you've gained from your research, whether you might like to say something too, and that might bring us to the end of the session, I'm afraid. But
yeah, I mean, I think both.
Do you want to take the mic? Oh no, your mic.
I'm sorry. Yeah,
sorry.
Yeah, both parts of that. I think definitely we need a fishing strategy, but it has to be nestled in part of this wider ambition to achieve good environmental status and to optimise these social, economic, and environmental outcomes. Like a fishing strategy, in absence of that, is missing the point. I think. On the subject of industrial fisheries, I mean, fisheries are on a spectrum. So the question is, are industrial fisheries optimising social, economic, and environmental outcomes? And I would say no, especially in the absence of good spatial management. A classic example, and I'm going to just reach to the Baltic here for a second, is that 90% of the biomass being removed from the Baltic goes to reduction fisheries, which is a euphemism for fish oil and fish meal, mostly because we like bacon and eggs and salmon to be cheap. And so we have to ask ourselves as a society, is that the best use of the resources? Most of the small-scale fishers in the Baltic are declining rapidly because that biomass was supplying ecosystem services to everything from cod to cetaceans and seabirds. And so, again, if we're looking at this in the context of good environmental status, we would be getting very different outcomes, and we better have a very different strategy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Claire, did you want to add anything? Or?
Yeah, just briefly. So I haven't just spoken to fishermen. I spoke to quite a few people who kind of represent fishing organisations or kind of people that work in that space of trying to give fishermen a voice. And particularly with offshore wind farms, I think the fishing industry has tried for a long time to be involved in the discussion of the development and the planning of wind farms, just to kind of have a seat at the table, shall we say, but they haven't been given that opportunity. And then up until quite recently, it would be that the wind farm was kind of planned and designed, and then the fishing industry would come in and say, well, actually, if you just move the turbines a little bit this way or had them slightly further apart, then that would help us. But at that point, it's too late. I think things are slowly changing, but giving the fishing, like making the fishing industry like a true stakeholder in the process, and having a fishing strategy that's actually valued rather than just an afterthought or a tick in the box is very important if we are to see the fishing industry survive, because certainly in the early stages of wind farm development, they just weren't allowed into that conversation. So.
Thank you very much. And I think on that note, we will need to finish. I want to do two things. First of all, I want to thank Coastal Futures for having provided a slot that is a full-on heavyweight look at fishing. I think that's really timely, so thank you very much indeed. And then secondly, of course, I want to thank all of our wonderful speakers and all of you for your questions, including those who aren't in the room. So thank you very much indeed.